Welcome in to Steelers Talk. I'm your host, Jack Sperry. Thank you guys for joining me here again here on Monday. Tomorrow we'll be back in studio for our live coverage of Mike McCarthy's introductory press conference as the head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers. That's all going to start at 1:30 p.m. Eastern Time. We'll be going live for 30 minutes of kind of pregame, if you want to call it that, and then we'll be actually streaming the actual press conference, and we'll be reacting to it live here on the channel. It's kind of a new kind of live stream that we're trying out here on Steelers Talk. So if that interests you, make sure you guys click that subscribe button if you haven't already. We're also going to continue to get you guys top-notch Steelers content. I am planning a Mike McCarthy offensive scheme breakdown video for tomorrow morning for you guys to enjoy. So if you guys want the very latest surrounding Mike McCarthy's, the beginning of his era as the head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers, his offensive and defensive coordinator searches, all that different stuff, we're going to have updates on that all throughout the coaching search here. And then, of course, we'll get into free agency, draft stuff throughout the offseason. It's definitely going to be an interesting offseason here, guys. It already is. So if you haven't already, click that subscribe button and join our family here on Steelers Talk. All right, so I wanted to kick off here in our PM News and Rumors video here with some very interesting quote-unquote reporting. It's more rumors than actual reporting, but multiple people are saying it now, which makes me think that, there's something to it, especially because these two guys did not get in-person interviews, and a lot of people are saying that the Steelers had a quote-unquote bad process by not bringing these two guys in for in-person interviews this week. And that's that Chris Shula and Nate Scheelhaase, the two Los Angeles Rams guys that so many people are really high on in terms of, who people wanted to hire as this team's next head coach. According to a number of people, including Andrew Filliponi, Tone Digz, two people, it's pony sourcing, so, take it with a grain of salt. But they said everything from Shula and Scheelhaase, quote-unquote, underwhelmed, to it got to as extreme as they just straight up bombed their interviews and they were not impressive whatsoever, or whatever they said to Art Rooney and Omar Khan, it wasn't, what they wanted to hear, whatever it was. And, this makes sense. It really does, guys, because it's like, well, if Art Rooney and Omar Khan thought that Chris Shula and Nate Scheelhaase were awesome candidates, then I can almost guarantee you they would have been brought back for a second in-person interview. But it doesn't even sound like the Steelers were even considering bringing them back in their initial virtual interviews and their plans for the team. And, those interviews were apparently so off base from where the Pittsburgh Steelers were in terms of what they wanted that they didn't even want to bring either one of them in for another visit, which does make sense. They hire Mike McCarthy after, just 3 in-person interviews. Obviously, you have to have 2 minority coaches. Those ended up being Brian Flores and Anthony Weaver, and then Mike McCarthy. And, to me, I usually don't try and believe pony sourcing because usually it's shaky at best or just flat out wrong, but this one actually does make a bit of sense because if the Steelers loved Shula and Scheelhaase's interviews, they would have gotten a second interview, and they didn't. And they didn't even schedule a second interview with either of them. So it really did seem like that Flores, Weaver, and McCarthy were the finalists, and it does kind of feel like McCarthy was their favorite from the very beginning of this process. And, there was reporting that the Steelers were initially interested in Shula. I think it was November, from Albert Breer saying that they would be interested in interviewing Shula, but apparently his interview did not go very well. Pony said that he bombed the interview, or at least his source says that he bombed the interview, and it did not go well. And, this could mean a lot of different things. This could mean that Shula and Scheelhaase just weren't impressive, period. This could mean that they wanted to completely overhaul the organization and wanted to add, a lot more personnel and a lot more people in the analytics department and all this different stuff. And, maybe Art and Omar just had no interest in that. And, I think that is actually probably the more likely reason. I find it hard to believe that Chris Shula and Nate Scheelhaase were just absolute bumbling idiots in these interviews. I think it has more to do with their plans for the team were more centered around maybe a full-scale rebuild, and Art and Omar don't have interest in that. They want to stay competitive. Maybe they wanted, they demanded new training facility. Maybe they wanted, a much larger staff and analytics department like the Rams have. And, by the way, if they asked for those things, I think those are fairly reasonable things to ask. A lot of these modern NFL teams that have very cash-rich ownership groups are willing to pay a lot of money in their analytics department and to pay a lot of coaches and, pay for a brand new training facility and all these different things. But the Rooneys are pretty cash poor. And especially if Shula and Scheelhaase were like, yeah, I want to completely tear this thing down to the studs, rebuild, trade everybody, that just didn't seem like the plan that Art Rooney and Omar Khan wanted to embrace. And, at the very least, it seems like Shula and Scheelhaase just didn't have the same vision for the team as ownership and the front office had. So for whatever reason, the connection there between Shula and Scheelhaase seems to not have been ideal. And, they found their guy in Mike McCarthy for better or for worse. And, I do want to kind of talk about the Mike McCarthy hire and the frustration around it because, I think it's pretty obvious why the reaction to the hire has been what it is. And it's just that it's different and it's the same in all the ways that Steelers fans did not want, going into this process. When Mike Tomlin stepped down, Steelers fans, in general, I would say the majority wanted Mike Tomlin to be fired and to embrace a new day and a new era and, a new, rebuild and, trade veteran players away and embrace a brand new culture and under a brand new young head coach to lead this team into the future of Steelers football. And then when Mike Tomlin stepped down, again, he wasn't fired, he stepped down, Steelers fans kind of treated it like, like it was a firing, like the Steelers were looking for something brand new. And I don't think that's what the Steelers were looking for at all at the end of the day. I think they wanted something similar to Mike Tomlin as much as Steelers fans wanted something different from Mike Tomlin. They saw a guy in Mike McCarthy, and just reading Art Rooney the second's statements on this, it just seems like that they saw Mike McCarthy's resume out there and they said, man, this guy's got, very similar record, very similar playoff accomplishments, very similar offensive production as guys like Sean Payton, for example. He's got a very similar career record and playoff track record to John Harbaugh, who is seen as like the belle of the ball in the coaching market this year. And then, the fact that he's a Pittsburgher and, he's got a connection to Aaron Rodgers, who the team has openly stated they would bring back with open arms this year. I think that was the icing on the cake for them. And, McCarthy provided Art Rooney II and Omar Khan everything that they were looking for. It just so happens that what Art and Omar were looking for was the complete opposite of what a lot of Steelers fans wanted. The Steelers fans wanted new. They wanted fresh. They wanted a rookie head coach. They wanted, a lot of them, a first-time, offensive play caller, all these different things. And, the Steelers were like, we like our roster right now. We feel like we're not that far away, for better or for worse. I think that there's very reasonable cases to be made for still trying to win. You are coming off of 3 straight double-digit win seasons. You're coming off a division championship. The division right now is not necessarily in the best of states. But I can also see the argument for we've been stagnant for multiple years now. We have a lot of money invested into veterans. We don't have a quarterback right now, or at least not a long-term option at quarterback. And we need to completely start over and embrace a new culture and finally embrace a rebuild. But, I think it's pretty obvious that the Steelers are not doing that at this point. But like I said, this hire with McCarthy, it feels different and the same in all the wrong ways to a lot of Steelers fans, because it feels like the same because it's an older head coach. It's somebody that's been a head coach in this league for almost 2 decades, just like Mike Tomlin was. It's a guy that wins in the regular season a lot, just like Mike Tomlin did. And then he's had recent postseason struggles, just like Mike Tomlin did. Now, McCarthy's actually won a playoff game, at least one of them in the last, 9 years or whatever it's been. But, it's just one. And, I think Steelers fans want somebody that can, at least have the upside of winning a Super Bowl. And I think the general consensus on Mike McCarthy is that, sure, he can get you to 10, 11, 12 wins. He can get you a good offense. But, when it comes time to get to the playoffs, he's going to get out coached. And, he's not going to be able to deliver when it really matters. And I think that is a perfectly reasonable take to have when it comes to this hiring. But, it's the same for a lot of the bad reasons, but it's also different for a lot of the reasons fans didn't want either. Like, it's different than what they've done in the past in terms of their hiring practices. They went out and got, young defensive-minded head coaches in their 3 previous hires, and they all ended up being Super Bowl champions, and they all ended up being, Hall of Famers or future Hall of Famers. And this is just such a 180 turn where you're not only not going young, you're hiring a 62-year-old who is already the oldest head coach in team history the first day he takes the job, but also he's an offensive-minded guy. Now, I don't think that was necessarily, the bad thing when it comes to this hire for a lot of people. I think a lot of people, the only thing that's really tethering them to any hope with this hire is that it is an offensive-minded head coach. He does have a QB developmental track record, but for a lot of people, this just feels like a repeat of Mike Tomlin. And I think in the eyes of Omar Khan and Art Rooney, who love Mike Tomlin, that's great. We brought in somebody with pretty much an identical track record of Mike Tomlin, who's one of the best coaches in the league. It's pretty close, track record to guys like Sean Payton, who just took his team to the AFC Championship game. Andy Reid didn't win a Super Bowl until he was in his 60s, and he won multiple of them in his 60s as a head coach, and Bill Belichick won multiple Super Bowls in his 60s as well in New England. So I don't think the age thing has much to do with the decision here at all. I think they saw somebody with a really good resume on paper, and then mixed with the fact that he's got a history with quarterback development and he's offensive minded, I think he really did have a good in-person interview last week. All those things combined, and I think that's how the Steelers come to the decision, for better or for worse. I understand why some people don't like it. I think I'm higher on the hire than a lot of people, but I understand why a lot of people who were hoping and got their hopes up for a brand new regime in a fresh take on the Pittsburgh Steelers are upset with this decision. I guess we can just hope that Mike delivers some results here, so we can all get behind him and all be happy with him as our head coach moving into the future. Because if he doesn't deliver those results pretty right away, it's the fans are not going to be very nice to Mike McCarthy, to say the least. But there's also like a number of reasonable concerns with this hire, right? Like, I feel like a lot of people think that I'm absolutely in love with this hire, but I went into this process, and McCarthy, out of the finalists, was probably the last person I would have hired personally. And there's a number of reasons for that. He's not really known as a great game manager. It's another, similarity that he has to Mike Tomlin. His teams tend to be heavily penalized and undisciplined, and that is something that I don't want here in Pittsburgh, and I hope he improves in his time here with the Steelers. Also, he's had some rough defensive coordinator hires. Mike Nolan, his first year in Dallas, and then Mike Zimmer, his final year in Dallas, absolute disasters. Now, he has, to be fair, he has had some really good defensive coordinator hires as well. Dan Quinn was an absolute home run for him, so hopefully he can, get his next Dan Quinn right away here in Pittsburgh. But also that lack of recent playoff success, I do think he has been outcoached in the postseason. So, I think that's a fair criticism of him as well. Even though it is really hard to win in the NFL postseason, I think people that work in football will tell you that. And that's why they respect McCarthy. It's why McCarthy has a lot of respect around the league, is that they understand how hard it is to win in the National Football League, and they know how difficult it is to find someone that can consistently win. And Mike McCarthy consistently wins in the National Football League. But obviously what fans care about most is what do you do in the postseason, because that's what matters. And frankly, recently it hasn't been very good, just like it wasn't with Mike Tomlin. Then also, I think another very fair criticism of Mike McCarthy is he only has one Super Bowl championship, despite the fact that he's had for sure two, elite level quarterbacks, and then he's had another really high end quarterback. Brett Favre and Aaron Rodgers were like MVP candidates, like perennial MVP candidate type of guys. And even though McCarthy did put up the offensive production with those guys, he didn't deliver the Super Bowl except for just the one time with Aaron Rodgers, and he came up short pretty consistently in the NFC Championship game. Now, to be fair, they did go to overtime multiple times in the NFC Championship game and lost. And, if you're going to overtime in the NFC Championship game, you are really that close to getting to the Super Bowl. And it's a good season for you. But then also Dak Prescott. Like Prescott in 2023 was an MVP runner-up. They were the number one offense in the league, and they only win one playoff game against an 8-9, Tom Brady Buccaneers team that, had a 45-year-old Tom Brady on it. So, I understand why, what the criticisms are on Mike McCarthy. And, even though I think there are, definable positives to this hire, he does have a really good track record of winning, of developing quarterback talent, and really the number one job of this hire all along was going to be to develop a quarterback. So I understand the hire and the decision from the Steelers, but I also understand why fans are definitely concerned and frustrated about this hire, considering where this team has been over the last decade under Mike Tomlin. Now, before I get into some other notes here, before I say goodbye for the evening, let's have a word from our sponsor here at Prize Picks. The big game in Santa Clara is almost here between the Seahawks and Patriots, and there's no better way to cash in during America's biggest sporting event than with Prize Picks, where it always feels good to be right. And since the big game is right around the corner, that also means it's your last chance to get into the football action before next season. So close the season out right with Prize Picks by getting $50 instantly in lineups when you play your first $5. Download the Prize Picks app today and use code CLNS to get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. That's code CLNS. Get $50 in lineups after you play your first $5 lineup. Prize Picks, it's good to be right. So something else that I wanted to talk about here is that it seems like the Pittsburgh Steelers decided to hire Mike McCarthy because they had a goal to develop the next quarterback of the Pittsburgh Steelers. And, with Mike's QB developmental background and his offensive track record, that's why he got the job. Okay. But my question is, if your goal was to find somebody to develop a young quarterback, why did you, talk with so many defensive coordinator type of head coaching candidates? I mean, you look at the list, and the only offensive guys that they talked to were Mike McCarthy, Nate Scheelhaase, and Clay Kubiak. It's only three of them. And they interviewed Jesse Minner and Anthony Weaver twice, and Brian Flores, and Ajiro Evero, and all these guys, these defensive guys. But like, if the goal was to find somebody to develop a quarterback, I feel like the candidates that they interviewed maybe were counterintuitive to that goal. Now, to be fair, Art Rooney did say at the beginning of this process the number one thing was to find the right leader for the organization. But like, is it impossible to find a leader for your organization that can also, be an offensive-minded guy and call plays and all those different things? I feel like if they wanted to make this search about finding a new quarterback and developing a quarterback, there were some other options out there that they could have interviewed that they didn't. Names like Clint Kubiak, Mike McDaniel is out there, Grant Udinski, Brian Dable, Joe Brady, Cliff Kingsbury, Davis Webb, Declan Doyle, Mike LaFleur. I mean, like, there's a lot of younger offensive minds out there. Now, I won't say that there was like a Ben Johnson level guy in this coaching cycle or something like that, or Kyle Shanahan or a Sean McVay necessarily, where it's like, this guy's going to be an absolute superstar for sure. If you went with one of these younger guys on the offensive side of the ball that's never been a head coach before, in some cases never called plays before in the NFL, then yeah, you would be taking a risk. There's no question about that. I will say what I've heard about Clint Kubiak from people in the league is that Clint is very reserved. He's pretty quiet. He's not really, somebody that has a great presence standing in front of a room, and he's not necessarily seen as somebody that's going to be like a fantastic quote-unquote leader of men. Now, I think that he's an awesome offensive mind, and, but people ask, why didn't they interview him? He's got a reputation in the league for being a little bit of a house mouse and being, somebody that's not a very strong personality. And I think that with the Pittsburgh Steelers, they want somebody that's got a little bit of presence to him. And, you might be saying Mike McCarthy doesn't have any presence to him, but like, McCarthy is a respected leader that definitely has a lot of respect from around the league and the people inside it. So But Clint Kubiak is somebody that's kind of got a reputation for not being a great leader. So that might be the reason why the Steelers decided not to interview him. But like if the goal was to develop a quarterback and find the guy that's capable of developing a quarterback, I mean, he took Sam Darnold, and who was already a good quarterback, by the way, but now they're going to the Super Bowl. I mean, he was one of the most productive quarterbacks in the National Football League this year. And it's not like their wide receiver room was like incredible. I mean, they got Jackson Smith and Jigba, who's a true alpha, but like Cooper Kupp is regressing, and they don't have like a ton of other dynamic weapons at their disposal. They do have Rashid Shaheed, which certainly helps, who's a downfield threat, but I think Clint did an awesome job with that Seattle Seahawks offense this year. I thought he did a pretty decent job with New Orleans the year before. There was just a bunch of injuries there, and I think he's a really bright offensive mind, and he was a top candidate for a lot of people in Steelers Nation for this job. Doesn't even get an interview. Like, I feel like I would want to at least interview Clint Kubiak, but I would have liked to interview Mike McDaniel, Grant Udinski, Brian Dable, even Cliff Kingsbury. These guys with experience and a track record of developing young quarterback talent in this league very, very recently, and they didn't interview any of them. So, if you want to criticize the Steelers' process, we put out a video earlier today about why I don't necessarily mind that they didn't do the in-person interviews with the Rams. Like, if you didn't like the Rams guys, they weren't going to get the job. I don't necessarily think it's bad process to waste their time, to bring them in here and, waste your time as well. Like, if you knew Mike McCarthy was the guy you're going to hire, I have no problem hiring him when you did. But, like, if the goal was to find somebody the best person to develop a young quarterback, it feels like you could have at least interviewed some of these other, younger, brighter offensive minds instead of just, interviewing Mike McCarthy, Clay Kubiak, and Nate Scheelhaase as the offensive options for you. So that's just my take on that situation. So if you want to criticize the Steelers' process here, I think that's probably the way to do it. But now I do want to talk here a little bit about how the Pittsburgh Steelers pretty clearly want Aaron Rodgers to return for another season. Now, like Adam Schefter keeps saying a million times on ESPN, they didn't hire McCarthy just to bring Rodgers back. They feel like even if Rodgers retires, McCarthy's resume and then his quarterback development track record will help them find the next quarterback of the future, whether Rodgers returns or not. But he also says that it doesn't hurt that, Mike McCarthy has that relationship with Aaron Rodgers. Connor Hughes, a Jets reporter, said at the end of the 2024 season that Rodgers would love to play for Mike McCarthy again. They do have a very good relationship. It got a bit salty at the end of their time together in Green Bay, but, they've reconciled, and, Rodgers has said that he would like to play for McCarthy again if given the opportunity. We also know Rodgers loved his time in Pittsburgh this past year. He's made some really good connections, most of which will be returning next year to the Pittsburgh Steelers. And we also know that to a person in the exit interviews, Steelers players want Rodgers back. They feel like he is still a high-end quarterback that can deliver results for this team, that's a great leader for this team, and that they want him back for another season. So it seems like if Rodgers does want to return to the Steelers, that will be the Steelers' plan A at starting quarterback this year. And I honestly think that there's worse options out there for the Pittsburgh Steelers at quarterback heading into 2026. I really do. And I do think that, especially if they can make the right decisions at wide receiver this offseason, this Steelers offense with Aaron Rodgers in a year two here, with established chemistry with Pat Freiermuth, DK Metcalf, Jalen Warren, Kenny Gainwell, Darnell Washington, then you add a couple of really good separators to the mix at wide receiver, this offense can legitimately take a pretty good step next season compared to where it was in 2025. I mean, first of all, I think what Rodgers did with a lack of a receiver room last year was pretty darn impressive. I mean, DK Metcalf, I would say, is a really good receiver, but he's not somebody that's going to be a true alpha, take on double teams and beat them. I don't see DK in that vein. And then when you add on top of that, Rodgers' next best receiver that he had during the season was Adam Thielen, who couldn't even play over Jalen Naylor in Minnesota. It just goes to show you how bad that wide receiver room was outside of DK Metcalf. And I just don't know why Steelers fans, rag on Rodgers for not, having a downfield, passing lighting it up, throwing the ball down the field, because he didn't have a lot of open receivers, plain and simply. And, he took what the defense gave him. He gave the ball to his playmakers out in space, because that's what the strength of the Steelers offense was last year. But if you can add a couple of legitimately good receiver pieces this year, along with the tight end pieces you already have, along with the running backs you already have, along with the offensive line that looked a lot better this season compared to previous seasons and is still growing and getting better with all their young talent. And then on top of it all, you bring in Mike McCarthy, who I think is an upgrade at offensive play caller compared to what we were getting with Arthur Smith. Like, I'm telling you, man, like if you make the right decisions at wide receiver this year, and you have a good amount of cap space, you've got 12 draft picks, you have the ammo to potentially even trade up for a top flight wide receiver if you want to go get a Jordan Tyson, if you want to get a Mekhi Lemon. If you want to get one of those top guys in the first round, you absolutely can do that. And, let's just say they trade up for Jordan Tyson, and then they bring in Romeo Doubs in free agency. I think that'd be a really good wide receiver trio, especially working with Aaron Rodgers. And then on top of that, you get Darnell Washington, Pat Freiermuth, Jalen Warren, Kenny Gainwell, all those great players that really play great roles here with the Steelers. And then you have a quarterback that gets the ball out fast, doesn't take a ton of sacks, and is one of the more intelligent quarterbacks in the league. I mean, you pair that with a defensive coordinator hire from Mike McCarthy that can get the most out of the defensive talent we have here. It really isn't far-fetched, guys, to think that the Pittsburgh Steelers can be better in 2026 than they were in 2025. That's just where I'm at with the whole thing. And then speaking of that defensive coordinator hire, we did get some whispers today. I think it was something Covington had a report. He's a beat reporter for the Giants, but he has some connections to Patrick Graham, and he says that Graham is a name to watch for the Steelers defensive coordinator job. I think Patrick Graham is a name where, they'll see former Raiders defensive coordinator next to his profile, and they'll immediately say, no, I don't want him here, because Raiders defense, let's face it, has not been terrific over the last several seasons under Graham. But to be fair to Graham, he has not had great personnel outside of Max Crosby, who has been injured the last 2 seasons, by the way. You look at those rosters over the last 2 years in Las Vegas, they have been atrocious. And even despite that, they haven't been like the worst defense in the league. They've punched above their weight. Just a couple seasons ago when Crosby was fully healthy, the Raiders defense was actually like top 10 in EPA per play and success rate. And like you look at the roster that season, they had nobody on that team as well. So I think Patrick Graham has been somebody, even going back to his days as defensive coordinator under Joe Judge in New York, he had some really good defenses there. And I really like his adaptability as a defensive play caller. Like he doesn't have, a set system where he tries to fit players into certain roles. He takes the players that he has and then, deploys a system centered around the talents of the team. And that is a sign of a really good coach, in my opinion. And Graham learned that working under Bill Belichick. So I actually think Patrick Graham would be a pretty inspired hiring by Mike McCarthy, and I would actually be down for that, because I think if you've watched Patrick Graham defenses over the last, half decade in the National Football League, you see somebody that's really smart, that does a lot of smart things schematically, and you pair that with the roster talent that he would have here in Pittsburgh, which would be by far the most that he's had anywhere else. I think he'd be a pretty good hire. Not to say, I wouldn't be down for a Durante Jones or a Raheem Morris or, maybe a bigger name that, sexier name that fans would want more. But if they end up hiring Patrick Graham, who, by the way, did work for McCarthy in Green Bay way back when, I think that would be a good hire for the Pittsburgh Steelers. Now, Mark Kaboly said on his podcast, after McCarthy was hired, the 2 names to watch out for that he's hearing are Al Harris, who is a former player for the Green Bay Packers and former DB's coach for the Dallas Cowboys when McCarthy was there, currently the pass game coordinator for the Bears, and then Anthony Weaver, who, the team interviewed for the head coaching position last week and was the only one to get a second interview with the team. The team does seem to be enamored with him, and New York Giants, a team that was expected to potentially hire him as their DC, ended up hiring Denard Wilson, another guy that comes over with Harbaugh from from the Ravens. So, Anthony Weaver, I think, would be a really good choice as DC here in Pittsburgh as well. I think he runs a modern defense, had a top 10 unit back in 2024, had some personnel deficiencies this year in Miami, to say the least, but he's another guy, man, where I think players love playing for him. I think he makes the most of what he's given, and I think he'd be a good fit here in Pittsburgh, especially because, as a younger guy, he might be like an heir apparent type of guy for Mike McCarthy. If McCarthy's only here for 4 or 5 years and then steps down, Anthony Weaver could be somebody, if he doesn't get poached, that is, to maybe be the next head coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers. So I'll leave you guys with that. Thank you guys so much for stopping by here today. Again, technically this is my day off, guys, but I put out 2 30-minute long Steelers videos for you guys to enjoy today because I love what I do, man. And, there's nothing I'd rather be doing. And even if I'm snowed in here and I don't technically, have to be doing stuff like this, I do want to get Steelers content out to you guys, because without you, I would not be, this channel would not be where it's at, and I wouldn't be able to do what I do every single day. So I just appreciate all of your guys' support. Make sure you guys click that subscribe button. Again, tomorrow I'm going to be trying to get a Mike McCarthy scheme video for you guys out in the morning, and then at 1:30 p.m. Eastern time tomorrow, we'll be going live for the introductory press conference for new Steelers head coach Mike McCarthy. So if you guys want to come react with us tomorrow, make sure you guys click that subscribe button and join us then. That'll be it for today's video. I'll see you guys next time, and until then, guys, here we go, Steelers.